Hello, my name is McGregor, and today I'll be presenting on the socioeconomic marginalization of opioid overdoses. So let's get into a brief history of opioids. Opium can be traced back to the 7th century in China, where it is believed to have been introduced by Arab traders. Over the centuries, the Chinese used it for numerous medicinal purposes, but eventually the Chinese began trading it throughout the globe. By this point, opium was also consumed recreationally through mixing with tobacco and smoking it, so there was a substantial demand worldwide for the drug. In the 1700s, the British Empire began exporting Chinese opium through the British East India Company, who were horrible and eventually led to two wars fought over it during the 1800s. Opium and its trade became very damaging to Chinese society at the time and disrupted the communities there for generations to come. Now, what's interesting is that opium in America is nothing new. It became available in the United States during the late 1700s as a result of British trade, since we were British colonies, and was used to treat wounded soldiers later in the Civil War in the 1800s. So, historical documents at the time even attribute addictive behavior to opium, and eventually in 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act regulated opioids and limited their recreational use. Since then, opioid prescription and use waned for a bit, but starting in the 1970s and 1980s, prescriptions skyrocketed, and today, stats taken from 2017 show that about 142 people die each day from opioid overdoses, which is very hard to fathom. Now let's define what an opioid actually is. As I just discussed, opium has been around for a long time. It is naturally derived from the poppy plant, which I'm showing on this slide, and cultures around the world have used it medicinally and recreationally over the centuries. Pharmaceutical companies today, on the other hand, either modify opium directly from the plant or synthesize similar medications based on the same chemical structure. Some of the more well-known medications that are commonly prescribed to patients include hydrocodone or Vicodin, oxycodone or Percocet, or morphine, codeine, and fentanyl. And they are just prescribed because they contain chemicals that relax the body and relieve pain. Specifically, physicians treat those suffering from chronic pain, moderate and severe pain with opioids, as well as those with severe coughs or diarrhea. Unfortunately, these medications can be highly addictive due to their mechanism, which I will now discuss. Now, environmental and individual factors influence whether a person will become dependent or addicted to opioids, but for those who do, the drug's ability to create an intense feeling of pleasure is a critical reason. When a person ingests an opioid, these chemicals travel to the mesolimbic reward system in the midbrain, where they bind to mu opioid receptors in the ventral tegmental area. Their binding to these mu receptors cause the release of dopamine throughout the brain, specifically in the nucleus accumbens, which then causes the feelings of pleasure that addicts feel. Research has shown that for some individuals, this pleasure activation is the strongest cause of addiction, but for many others, especially after an extended period of time, it is the physiological symptoms of withdrawal that drives addiction. Now, opioids begin to exert their physiological withdrawal symptoms at the locus coeruleus at the base of the brain when opioids are ingested. They also bind to mu opioid receptors here, which then results in a suppression of noradrenaline. This is important because noradrenaline is a hormone which causes the body to feel alert and active. So when this is suppressed, it creates feelings of intoxication. However, since this hormone is essential for survival, the locus coeruleus eventually modulates its own activity to release noradrenaline in greater amounts to overcome the inhibition that opioids cause. When the opioids are not present in the system anymore, the increase of this hormone causes anxiety, jitters, cramps, and other unpleasant withdrawal symptoms. So we can see that an addicted patient would need to consume more and more opioids to prevent these symptoms, which really just causes higher amounts of noradrenaline to be secreted after the high. And eventually this leads to cardiac arrest and even death. And this is the mechanism of overdose. So Researchers and policymakers have been aware of the addictive nature of opioid medications for quite some time now. So as a result, there are potential ethical and legal issues of prescribing severely addictive and harmful medications. According to the American Medical Association's Code of Ethics, physicians have an obligation to relieve pain and suffering. Now, I personally agree with this statement because many people suffer from some sort of pain. A survey conducted in 2018 showed that among the top 10 leading debilitating diseases and conditions, low back pain actually ranked first, and chronic neck pain ranked fourth. This is important because it shows the prevalence of acute and chronic pain globally. Now, ethically speaking, a patient should not be denied treatment for their pain, but the recent increase in opioid prescription and overdoses cannot be ignored. In America in 1998, the number of opioid prescriptions reached about 100 million, but by the end of that year, this number increased to 190 million. And by 2017, we're now at 290 million opioid prescriptions. And it is estimated that more than 10 million citizens in the United States are using opioids for non-prescription use, and more than 2 million Americans are currently diagnosed with an opioid addiction, which is difficult to fathom. In 2015 alone, 33,000 people died from an opioid overdose. And to put that in perspective, I believe 35,000 die from a car accident each year, according to the CDC. So that's a lot of people. So you might be able to see how a physician's oath to do no harm and their obligation to alleviate pain can come into conflict. Promoting the right to pain management as a human right, if taken to the extreme, would allow for a patient to request any type of pain medication they want, which could harm them. It is important to not only be willing to provide medications for pain relief, but also to educate patients on the risk as well. Researchers show that there is significant socioeconomic marginalization that occurs when it comes to the opioid crisis as well, which I will discuss shortly. Now, I conducted a small scale survey questionnaire regarding personal beliefs on opioid prescriptions myself. And as you can see, the majority of participants were in the 20 to 29 age group, but I did get some from the 40 to 60-year-old age group, which was good to see. The majority of participants were actually from the Midwest, but we did have representation from international students, the West, the Southwest, and also the Southeast, which is good to see. And the majority of participants were Caucasian. But for the first statement, I said that opioid medications are addictive. As you can see here, 71% of participants strongly agreed that opioids are addictive, 19% agreed, and surprisingly, almost 10% were neutral on the statement. Now, a similar trend was seen in this question or statement, which states there is a current health crisis due to the overprescription of addictive opioid medications, with about 62% strongly agreeing with that, and 29% agreeing, and then roughly 10% were neutral. Now, I asked this question to see if the population I was polling believed that the best way to treat chronic pain was through prevention by a healthy lifestyle. I stated, Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Therefore, it is better to live a healthy life to prevent pain, disease, and injury rather than treating with addictive medications. Now, I was surprised by these results because I personally thought that many people would not agree with this statement because I see it as not so empathetic to people's pain. But as you can see here, almost half of the population strongly agreed, 33% agreed, but then about 14% were neutral. And it looks like one or two people disagreed with it as well, which is nice to see. My fourth statement was the prescription of highly addictive medications such as opioids should be banned. Administration of such drugs should be allowed only under terminal diagnoses. Now, this question yielded expected results with questions such as this. I was really playing the devil's advocate and hoped that participants would reflect a little more empathy, which I think happened here. And the statement says, opioids can be prescribed for short-term use to prevent relief from surgeries, such as pregnancy, deliveries, wisdom teeth removal, bone reconstruction, etc. Now, this is more reasonable and reflects what I personally believe. Opioids have great therapeutic effects for use during surgery and after surgery, especially if a patient is experiencing substantial pain during a short term recovery. Now, I've personally taken oxycodone after reconstructive arm surgery. It was prescribed by a physician, and I agree with the participants of this survey that opioids can have benefits when prescribed and taken in a responsible manner. And lastly, I stated opioids should be prescribed without question to those suffering with chronic pain from cancers, back injuries, etc. Now, I formed this question more of an absolute because I wanted to see how passionate participants were on opioid prescription. And what shocked me is that the results showed that the majority did not agree with and were neutral towards the statement. These results and those from previous slides shows that participants are educated on the addictive nature of opioids. Now, one goal I had for this presentation was not only to assess public knowledge of the opioid crisis, but I also wanted to bring awareness to the socioeconomic marginalization that surrounds this epidemic in America. A systematic review conducted by Drannon and colleagues analyzed the risk factors and associations between several socioeconomic factors and opioid overdoses. They found that a significant association between run-ins with the law and opioid overdoses exists. They also found that overdoses occurred at higher rates after release from prison, meaning that those who were released had a greater chance of overdosing. And also, the longer a person was incarcerated, the greater their chance was for opioid overdoses. They also found that those that had lower socioeconomic status had a significantly higher chance of overdosing from opioids. These overdose rates are higher in low income areas and in situations where people are living in poverty. In America, racialized populations are more highly represented in low income overdose fatality rates than non racialized populations. And this can be a tough pill to swallow, but it shows me that socioeconomic reform is needed to help address the opioid crisis. When opioid addiction is discussed as a chronic disorder of the brain, it's also important to understand that some individuals are more susceptible to drug use and addiction than others because of genetic factors, added stress, and a host of environmental and social factors that makes them more vulnerable. The CDC also lists those in poverty and on Medicaid to be at a higher risk for prescription drug overdose, and this can be partly attributed to a lack of quality of care that those in higher socioeconomic brackets have access to. Specifically, according to the US Department of Health and Human Services, people on Medicaid are more likely to be prescribed opioids even at higher doses and for longer durations, which in turn increases their risk for addiction and its associated consequences. They are also likely to have access to evidence-based, well, they're less likely to have access to evidence-based addiction treatment. But psychological factors also play a role. Much of the increased mortality among middle-aged white Americans can be attributed to health effects of substance use, especially among those with less education who have faced increasing economic challenges and increased psychological stress as well. Many studies have also been included which prove that unemployment is significantly associated with opioid overdoses. Research in 2017 showed that when the country unemployment rate increases by just 1 percentage point, the opioid death rate per 100,000 people rises by 3.6%, and opioid overdose emergency room visits per 100,000 people increased by 7%. Exclusion and isolation also significantly raises the risk for opioid overdoses. Family fragmentation, singleness, divorce, and similar factors that are more significant in low socioeconomic spheres also raise the risk. This makes sense because numerous animal studies have also demonstrated over the years how isolated animals show greater opioid self-administration than animals housed together, which is pretty interesting. Now, the study also shows that the higher level of education an individual has, particularly a graduate education, the lower risk of opioid overdose that they have. This is significant because although it is not impossible, statistically it is unlikely that those from poverty or socioeconomically depressed backgrounds will complete graduate school in America. This is a problem because it links education or the lack of education with an increased risk of opioid overdoses. This adds to the evidence that those at lower income levels are at a higher risk for overdoses. So it is evident that those that are socioeconomically disadvantaged are at a higher risk for opioid overdoses, which I've just outlined. There are several reasons for this, starting with incarcerations. Now, the Federal Bureau of Prisons claims that roughly 46% of incarcerations are for drug related offenses, which is the largest category by far of incarcerations. Since such a large portion of inmates go to jail for drugs, the connections between increased risk for overdoses and incarceration makes sense. In America and around the world, it is likely that if you are at the poverty level, you lack quality medical care. While many at the poverty level in America qualify for government assistance in the form of Medicaid, the CDC recognizes again that being on Medicaid significantly increases the risk for opioid overdoses. Those at the poverty level are more often prescribed opioids for pain um, for longer durations and at higher concentrations, which leads to increased addiction. These stats go hand in hand with unemployment, lack of social support, and lack of education, which are all hallmarks of low socioeconomic status. Now, it is obvious that the opioid crisis affects those with a lower tier in society more than those that are more affluent, and steps should be taken to remedy this. This could look like including opioid education in schools for children, restructuring guidelines for prescribing opioids, and also providing better quality of care for those in need. Now, unfortunately, in the age of COVID, researchers predict an enormous spike in opioid overdoses due to imposed self isolation. According to the American Medical Association, currently more than 40 states have reported increases in opioid related mortality, as well as ongoing concerns for those with a mental illness of substance use disorder. Statistics also show that those from low socioeconomic sectors have been hit particularly harder by the COVID pandemic, not only through health factors, but economically as well. And early data predicts that those who are marginalized will have significant higher risk factors for opioid overdoses, which is really sad. A doctor carries the responsibility to do no harm and also has the obligation to remedy and treat pain of all patients, regardless of socioeconomic status. But unfortunately, the lines have become blurred in America, and those with lower statuses suffer more than those that are higher up. It is up to the next generation of doctors, lawmakers, and policymakers to fix this trend and hopefully reverse the deadly statistics of the opioid crisis. Thank you.